So I'm going to be speaking for about an hour today, which is really just enough time to touch on the topics of the intersection of work and cancer. But there is always more to discuss, so we'll have some time after the presentation for Q&A, and I'll also provide you guys with my contact information at the end. So you're going to notice that today's slides are kind of set up in a story arc to give us some structure to these issues. I imagine that a lot of you are in different places. I heard someone was looking for a career change, someone is interviewing right now, so you might find some things to take with you today that are helpful now or to take with you and that will be helpful later. But regardless of where you are today, there is different information along every point of this arc that can be applied in different ways of our naturally less structured path that we all follow in our real lives. So we're going to start today by thinking about the various tensions and challenges that come up after receiving a diagnosis. Specifically, when we start thinking about work and life and how everything's going to come together, it's important to recognize that a lot of questions are going to crop up. And sometimes the answers to those questions are naturally in conflict with one another because that's the way life works, right? And so in the midst of all this asking and answering, there's two overarching questions that you're going to want to ask to illuminate the best path forward for you. So the first is how important,
Are these slides in our packet?
They are not, but I'd be happy to email them to you if you'd like them afterwards. It's a lot of information, so I totally understand, and I would happily send them to you. So the first question is, how important is work to you personally? And then, what information do you really need to make good decisions about work? So inevitably, this will lead to a host of additional questions because, as we all know, what we want is not always what we can do. And so the question remains, how do we find a path that's workable for ourselves? So some additional questions to consider include, how will work affect your treatment and schedule, and vice versa? So talking with your healthcare provider can be really helpful with this, an area where I'm sure you guys are all already experts. You also want to think about things like when are your side effects likely to kick in? So some treatment protocols, you start feeling bad almost immediately, in which case you might want to consider scheduling your treatments for a Friday so you have the weekend to recover and you don't have to risk taking time off. Or it's possible you're on a treatment protocol that doesn't make you start feeling those side effects until a few days later, in which case a Wednesday might be helpful, and so you start feeling them on the weekends. I encourage you to be proactive about all this. So often our doctors will say, can you come in on Tuesday? And we'll just go with it. But sometimes, while there is a need for them to see you on a Tuesday, it's just the first available appointment. And so if there's a Thursday appointment that might work better with your schedule, it might work out for everyone. So it's always good to be proactive in this process. It's also really important to talk to your healthcare team about parts of your work week, such as your commute. So we don't magically appear at work, which I wish I did. We have to take steps to get ourselves there. So you'll want to find out whether it's going to be realistic to continue sitting for 90 minutes in rush hour traffic each way, or if you ride public transportation, are you going to be able to handle the cold and flu season on the bus or on the subway? And of course, no person's only their diagnosis, so what other things do you think you'd want to save your time for and energy for? A new hobby, exercising, maybe you've taken a cooking class that you're particularly passionate about, because all of us, no matter who we are, only have a limited pool of internal resources and energy that we divvy up into our own personal pie chart. And so when you throw cancer into the mix, that pie chart gets smaller and smaller. So it becomes really important as treatment continues to prioritize as best as you can. And clearly finances and insurance is usually tied to our jobs and very important, and so often those are the driving factors in making decisions about whether or not you're going to work during treatment. But they actually aren't the driving factors for everyone, or maybe there's some importance, but it's not the number one important thing. Many people want to continue working because first and foremost, it's part of their identity. It's who you are, particularly in this country where when we first meet someone, we don't ask, where did you go on vacation last, or what's the last book you read? We ask, what do you do? And that's a really profound question. How do you contribute to the world? So for a lot of people, finding out that they won't be able to work or that their ability to work will be compromised can lead to a secondary crisis, an identity crisis. So you're going to want to talk to your healthcare team about this, not only because it will help them to understand where you're coming from, but also so that you can think about how you'll take care of yourself emotionally if things look like they might start to change. And that's totally something that your social worker can help you with, or close supportive networks, so support groups, or even organizations like this. So I mentioned earlier you're going to want to gather some information to help you make these decisions. So this slide illustrates the 3 buckets of information that they can be sorted. The first is medical and treatment information, which we just touched on a bit, but I just want to make another important point that it's important to share specific information with your healthcare team about what it is that you do for work. It's not enough to just tell them what your title is, to say I'm an executive assistant. Try to be more detailed about your responsibilities and routines so they understand what your day really looks like and how some of these side effects might affect that. The next bucket is work information. So you'll want to look into benefits you have, such as paid time off and health insurance, but also existing workplace policies like a donated leave pool where other staff can give back vacation and sick days so that someone who needs additional days can use them without losing pay. This policy actually is becoming much more prevalent, so it's something to look into if that's a possibility. These things are found in your employee handbook or the paperwork that you sign when you first get hired. And the third category is legal information. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a social worker, I'm not an attorney. So if you have specific questions about your situation, I definitely encourage you to follow up with a legal organization or an attorney. I'll be sharing some resources at the end if you guys do have legal questions. But the law does play a very important role in thinking about work and talking about work and cancer, which is really why we include it. Understandably, it can be a little scary to think about the law in terms of our jobs, so I just want to stress that we're talking about this topic just because we think not because we think it's likely that an employment situation will become litigious, but rather because legal and practical issues do not exist in a vacuum. So often where there's practical concerns, there's going to be a legal piece to it as well. And so for many people, knowing the law becomes the key tool for helping them pull together a plan for working through treatment. So I want you all to leave here knowing that the law can be a good tool for you to use as you figure out how to best balance work and cancer. So for the purposes of today, the key law we're going to touch on is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, just using the bathroom or going into ADA accessible places. So to start, the ADA is a federal law, and it applies in all 50 states. The part that's relevant to work and cancer comes from Title I. And like all laws, it has certain requirements that must be met in order to use it. So in very broad strokes for the ADA, they are your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. You must have the necessary skills, certifications, trainings to do the job, and your disability must meet the criteria determined by the ADA. So if you meet these requirements, the ADA can protect you from discrimination and may also provide you with reasonable accommodations, which is another thing I will talk about in a few slides later. And again, I just want to give you this quick overview just so you know that the ADA is something that you can consider. But I do encourage you, again, to speak with a legal professional if you think that this is something you'd like to know if you're eligible to use. So I do want to spend a little time talking about the online space. I speak to people daily and hear stories all the time about the role that the internet is playing in helping people through cancer treatments. Just being here this morning, I've heard a number of people discussing Facebook groups that they're a part of and CaringBridge and things like that. It creates a sense of community. Sometimes people blog to help them feel better. And this can be an incredible benefit in terms of feeling better in the moment. But it's also creating a written record of something that's relatively difficult to get rid of. So not necessarily, it's actually becoming more and more common that employers and hiring managers are Googling employees prior to hiring them or when they already work there. And it's not necessarily to find something negative about them, but rather to find out more about some candidate that they like or to find out more about the people that they're working with. But it is still possible that they're going to come across something that you'd rather them not know. So I want to be very clear, I'm not saying never post and don't go online, but rather it's important to have a better understanding of the virtual landscape so that you can feel empowered to make more informed decisions about how your story is being presented online. So I'm guessing that at least some of you in the room may be thinking, I'm always very careful with my privacy settings, so doesn't that mean I'm always protected? And unfortunately, the answer to that is that it's a little bit more complicated. So you're not supposed to be able to read this, but this is a picture from the Wall Street Journal from March of 2013, and it illustrates all of the steps that someone would have to take in order to have a fully protected Facebook profile. So think about the time it would take to go through all of these steps. And what makes this conversation even more complicated is that by April 2013, these were probably outdated because Facebook and sites like them change their privacy policies frequently and very often without notice. So it's entirely possible that if you were to actually take the time and go through all of these painstaking steps to make a Facebook profile completely private, you could wake up the next day to find that the policies have changed and your profile is no longer private. And so the reason that these change so frequently is that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and sites like them are designed to sell us things, which is to say they make their money through collecting data and selling it to advertisers. So in order to keep making new deals with those advertisers, they change those policies frequently and often without notice. So on the plus side, this is one of the reasons that Facebook and Instagram is free, but it does make trying to keep up with those changes pretty impractical and very time-consuming. So the idea here is that you want to be thinking about the fact that even those online spaces where you've invited people in and they've invited you in and there are privacy settings, it doesn't mean it's a perfectly secure and structured system. So there are some sites that have a higher level of security. I'm guessing some of you are already familiar with these two sites, My Lifeline and Caring Bridge. For those of you who aren't, they're both social networking sites that are specifically designed to be a safe space in order to share updates about how treatment's going, how you're feeling, and any general updates you want to share. They're a more controlled environment with a higher level of privacy than a mainstream social media network, and their privacy policies are much easier to follow and rarely change, and in my experience, the changes have been mostly cosmetic and not functional. But profiles on their site are not automatically protected at 100%, so if you're going to use these sites, it's worth taking the time to read through the privacy policies and figure out what protections are going to be best for you. In those packets, there should be a managing privacy handout, and these walk you through how to have a completely secure profile on these two pages. Overall, it's a really good idea to make sure that you've done your homework regarding privacy on any site, because once information is out there, it's out there and it can have a potential long-term impact. So now the question becomes, if privacy policies provide imperfect protection, what other steps can we take? So we recommend developing a personal disclosure plan. One step is to make clear decisions about what, if any, information you're going to share about your cancer journey online and where you're going to share it in terms of websites or blogs. And as you're thinking about this, what's going to work best for you, it's a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. So it may be the case that some of you have disclosed at work and everyone is being really supportive, and that's an outstanding position to be in. But the fact is that the internet doesn't go away. So you might find yourself looking for a new job 5 years from now, and your super supportive supervisor may move on and be replaced by someone who decides she'd like to Google all of her staff. And there's really no way to know how she's going to respond to what she finds online. So once you've made your decisions about disclosing, communicate those decisions with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people that you're connected to online. Because unfortunately, I've had a lot of conversations with people who were accidentally outed by, concerned, well-intended friends, but at the end of the day, they just didn't express that they would like to have their information to be private. So you may also want to consider your relationship to the larger cancer community. So if you volunteer with a cancer-related organization, or I'm sure a lot of you like the pages for a Cure Insight and other cancer organizations on Facebook, you just want to think about how you might describe that affiliation. So you might want to say that you support the organization, but maybe not explain that you're a survivor yourself. And that's totally fine. You can mention that affiliation. Just be careful to give careful thought to the language you're using when you're talking about your involvement. So this brings us to what you can do in order to take control about you in a Google search. There are plenty of opportunities to take control of that by taking a strategic approach to what you post online. So people don't know what you don't share with them, and in a work context, social media is a forum where you can not only tell but also show people who you are as a professional. Social media sites like LinkedIn, Twitter, and others you see listed here rank very highly on Google searches, so becoming active on these sites and presenting a voice that represents who you are as a professional is an excellent way to elevate your brand. So with that said, keep in mind that different platforms have different audiences. So you may share information about a book you just read on Facebook, and that might not be the most appropriate for LinkedIn unless you're an editor or a publisher and it relates to the work that you do. LinkedIn is really more of the space to let people know that you have a new certification or you wrote about a blog about your work or your industry. So when building an online brand, you want to think strategically about what you post. We recommend running each post through a filter. Would I want my boss, current or future, or my coworkers to know this about me? Would I want this on the front page of a newspaper or the front page of my favorite news site? Would I want my grandmother or my mother to see this? You can delete posts that are no longer represent your interests, but keep in mind that though they might be harder to find, they'll likely still be out there somewhere. So now we're going to transition from the online space back into the actual work environment to talk about working through treatment. So what you see here on this slide is a little bit of data to set the scene, which comes from a survey Cancer and Careers did with Harris Poll in 2017. So you'll see the top 5 reasons that survivors continue working after a diagnosis. Financial reasons and health insurance were obviously highly important, but that's probably not surprising to you. But what is significant is that 51% of survivors wanted to keep working because they felt well enough. And work also played a large role in helping them to feel normal, whatever normal was for them, and to feel productive and busy. So a solid 65% of employed survivors reported that working during treatment helped them cope during their cancer journey. So what all of this really illustrates is the point that we discussed earlier, that work provides a sense of meaning and purpose for many people, and also that the act of working itself is beneficial for many people while they're going through treatment. So it's just something to keep in mind. So when it comes to disclosing at work, like all of the rest of the decisions around just sharing this news, it's incredibly personal and one that requires a lot of thought, and it's typically not an all or nothing scenario. So just so we're all on the same page, you're not required to provide information about your health or your health history to your current employer or prospective, nor can they ask. So it's just really important that you're aware of this. There's definitely some scenarios where you're going to be asked and it puts you in an awkward position. Do you want to correct your interviewer? But the bottom line is that you do not need to answer these questions, and a current employer as well should not be asking you about what your current health status is. So as you're thinking through whether to share or not, it's important to consider all of the angles involved. So when deciding to disclose about your cancer status at work, there are 2 major considerations overall. First, how will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And second, what legal benefits are there to sharing this kind of information? So it's important to note that many people want to disclose for a variety of reasons. Some people are sharers, and they can't imagine going through such a huge life-changing event and not telling the people around them. But some are much more private and feel very uncomfortable sharing personal information in that kind of scenario. So it's about knowing who you are, and that however you feel about sharing is completely valid and should be taken into account. So also the individual culture of the workplace may also play a role. Is it a small company where your colleagues feel like a second family and everyone's always talking about vacations and kids and weekends? Or is it a big corporation where the environment's more competitive and everyone's always heads down getting work done? Or perhaps it's a big company that feels like a small family. The bottom line is that thinking about the various ways that people communicate with each other at work may help you decide if, what, how you might want to share that information at work. And you might also want to think about whether anyone at your workplace has gone through something similar. So not necessarily cancer, but perhaps there was someone who got pregnant and went on maternity leave, or a guy a few cubicles over who had to care for an elderly parent. What kind of flexibilities did the workplace make for them, if any? And how was the news received both by managers and other members of the team? Were people willing to step up and pitch in, or was there grumbling about extra work behind their backs? Because it can be incredibly valuable to consider these experiences as you begin to make those decisions about what you can expect from your own experience if you do share that information. It can also be important to consider past performance reviews. So for example, if you've been at a company for 5 years and always gotten gold star reviews, and you've just been notified by your healthcare team that fatigue will be a major side effect, you might want to share this information with your manager so that there aren't any gaps in understanding if you're not meeting the same marks that you once were, because without context, it might look like you're just slacking off and there's a decline in performance. And if that goes into a performance review, that could have a long-lasting impact. So we also get asked a lot, who should I tell? And that's going to vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. It's also possible you might find yourself having this conversation more than once, unfortunately. So if that's the case, we recommend going to the person with that it's going to be easiest to talk to. So for a lot of people, that's going to be your supervisor, because that's someone who you can have an ongoing conversation with and who could potentially be an advocate for you with the higher ups. But it's also important to bear in mind that most managers aren't trained to be managers, as I'm sure you guys can all relate to. So this may be the first time that they're having this kind of conversation, and they may feel like they're in uncharted territory themselves. So it often puts, unfortunately, the burden on the employee with cancer to help teach the manager what they have to do next. So in your packets, we also have something that we came up with called a manager's toolkit. This is something that survivors asked us for because they wanted something concrete to be able to provide to their employer to let them know what they're going through and how to best be supported. This can be a tool that's really useful, and it also can relieve you of some of that pressure and burden of kind of figuring out next steps. So for other people, their supervisor may be off the table, so they might want to go to HR instead. Based on my conversations and interactions with patients and survivors over the years, what we found is that many people tend to have very strong feelings about HR, both good and bad. But regardless of how you feel about them, they can be a font of information because they're the ones who understand that employee handbook and all of the policies that are in it. And they may have had this experience with similar people in the past. But perhaps the most important detail is if you're going to disclose in any of these conversations, it's the idea that treatment is going to be fluid. What you know and share now could be different in a week, 6 weeks, 2 months. So this is likely going to be an ongoing conversation. So this can help your employer understand that you intend to communicate with the most updated information that you can and to, in more or less words, be an open book in terms of information that you want to share with them and working with them. So now, with all of that said, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling with a conversation at work is one that can be intimidating to a lot of people, which is totally understandable. So what we've given you here are a couple of examples of how you might start the conversation. This language might work for you word for word, and if it does, obviously you're welcome to use it. But you might want to rework it if you feel that it could be more sounding like you or to your specific job. But overall, when you're preparing to start these conversations, it's important to weave in the idea that you want to work with your employer to come up with a plan that ensures both your needs and their needs are going to be met. And of course, having this manager's toolkit with you and explaining what it is can be very helpful with having this conversation as well. You want to just take a second to read that. So you're also going to want to spend some time thinking about the reality of your physical self in the workplace, how you personally are going to manage any of the wide array of possible side effects. So as we talked about earlier, this is another area you're going to want to talk to your healthcare team about so you can understand which side effects you are likely to have and how those might be managed at work so that you can feel comfortable and productive. But it's also important to think about any potential visible physical side effects, especially if you choose or have chosen not to disclose any information at work. Your colleagues may start to ask questions, and typically these are from places of kindness and concern, but they can also catch people off guard and create a really uncomfortable situation where you might have to accidentally disclose something that you would have otherwise chosen not to. So it's smart to spend some time thinking about how you might answer some of these questions if they inevitably come up. And again, another area where social workers and support networks can be really helpful to practice these questions and your emotional attachment to the answers. So your disclosure decisions will drive some of your strategy about how you communicate at work. However, whether or not you have disclosed, make sure you're creating a dialogue at work that supports your goals. So one strategy is to identify a point person, and this clearly isn't going to work in all work environments, but in settings where it does, it can be a really excellent solution. This would be someone that you trust and who's willing to be a centralized source of information about you and how you're feeling. They can also prevent you from having to update everyone constantly. They also can be your go-to person to find out what's happening in the office if you're out for some time, either getting treatment, doctor's appointments, whatnot. Again, it's really critical to be clear about your priorities and have a good understanding of what your team is expecting from you and how you will deliver it. So whether or not you've disclosed, this is something you should do in collaboration with your supervisor if you can. And then the final point is a really big challenge. This is a time where it's critical that you're honest with yourself and set fair boundaries for yourself about what you can and cannot do, and make sure to stick to them. Something to keep in mind is that the way we articulate ourselves in the workplace is going to be different from the way we express ourselves at home or to a loved one. In our home lives, when we've reached our limit, we might express ourselves in a more verbal, loud, slam the door kind of way. Obviously, that's not going to work in most work scenarios. So the other piece of this is figuring out where your limits are and recognizing those signs before you reach them so that you can readjust before it happens. So recognizing what your triggers are. Are there coworkers that particularly get under your skin? Is there a meeting every week that drives you crazy? And just really understanding how to deal with those emotions around those triggers. What often helps with this is what we call professional no's. Social workers, again, can be helpful helping you recognize where those intense trigger points are for you and how to mitigate them for yourself. So here are some examples. So I appreciate that you thought of me for this project, but I'm a bit swamped this week and I'm concerned about my ability to get this back to you in a timely manner. While internally that might feel like a failure on your part, you're being honest and you're letting them know where you're at and what your boundaries are and you're sticking to them. And it doesn't feel easy, but in the end, it will be very, very helpful for you. As we discussed side effects, chemobrain or brain fog is one we get asked about most frequently. Unfortunately, there is no magic bullet solution. My first piece of advice is to let go of the idea of multitasking because according to studies, only 2% of people are good multitaskers. So basically, no one's good at it, and I am speaking from my own experience. So to combat this, we recommend just going back to the basics. Writing down lists of priorities, turning off your phone or email notifications so that they don't cause any distractions for you, and focusing on one thing at a time. Writing everything down is a really good practice so you always have a record and don't rely on your memory so much. Obviously, my memory, I need my notes. It's totally acceptable, right? So try to keep a single notebook with all of your to-do things in one place so that you don't wind up in a meeting with your grocery list as opposed to your talking points. Additionally, it's a good idea to take the time to rehearse everything from presentations to project updates, even phone calls. Perhaps if you're in sales, you know there are certain points that you have to make on each call. If you work in an office type environment that has a shared calendar, it can be a great idea to just block off some time for yourself on that calendar so people know that you're not reachable at that time and you're busy. It can also take some of the pressure off of you having to feel like you need to immediately respond to emails or calls because stress can really inhibit our ability to focus. And to that point, simple stress relief practices can be really helpful. 2 to 3 minutes of deep breathing exercises or meditation can be easily done at a desk or in a break room, or even just taking a walk around the block can go a long way in terms of helping you to hit the reset button. And I know Anne, that was in here before, had some really great suggestions as well. Another workplace strategy is to use reasonable accommodations, which is what I mentioned earlier are one of the benefits of the ADA if you qualify. So basically, they are tools that you can use to make working through treatment or returning to work after treatment much more manageable. It's much easier to think about how these work with examples, so I'm going to go over those in just a minute. But before we move on, just to note that there's a lot of information on what reasonable accommodations are, how to use them, and how they can be valuable for both you and your employer. So you can check out the Cancer and Careers website as well as the additional resources that are listed below. And finally, it's important to remember that even if your employer isn't required to provide you with an accommodation, so perhaps they have less than 15 employees, it doesn't mean that making some small modifications to your work environment isn't something that would be doable for them. So as I said, it's easiest to show with examples. So this is one. We worked with a young woman who was a social worker, and she was going through cancer treatment, and work was incredibly important to her overall well-being and her sense of self. So one of her side effects was extreme nausea, which wasn't necessarily impossible for her to manage, but what she began to notice was that it was exacerbated when she was at work to a degree that became unmanageable. And she realized that it wasn't as bad at home, and it wasn't as bad during the same hours on the weekend. So it seemed a little strange to her that she was so sick at work specifically. And so we zeroed in on that, and through some conversations, realized that her office was next to the cafeteria. And so the smells were coming in and making her nausea extremely, extremely bad. So for her, an accommodation was to change offices. And not that that made working through treatment a breeze by any means, but it did change her ability to work, and for her, that was really critical. Another example is a gentleman who worked in the finance department in an office, and one of his side effects was fatigue. His role included a lot of printing, and for some inexplicable reason, the room where the printers, scanners, copy machines were was 2 floors below him, and the most direct way to get there was through the stairs. So he's going up and down the stairs all day long to retrieve documents, ultimately walking extra miles every day. So his fatigue clearly made this process much more challenging, and for him, an accommodation was a printer at his desk. So as you can see, there's no one-size-fits-all accommodation in an environmental way for every person. It's really about peeling away the layers of what's happening in your workspace, which can take some time to do, as it did with the social worker, and then being really creative about possible solutions. There are a number of questions you can ask yourself in order to help identify other potential accommodations. So, for example, can you work a full-time but flexible schedule? So this would mean you work the same number of hours, they're just distributed differently. Varying the start and end times of the day to maximize the hours that you feel good. If you feel great in the morning, then maybe your 9 to 5 days should become a 7 to 3 day. Or take time out during the day to go to an appointment. You can make time up by working later that day or later in the week. Again, this might not work for someone who might be customer, client-facing, having to be there during certain operating hours, but it could be a really great solution for people who do project-based work and work that would fit into a more flexible schedule. Another question would be, can you work from home part-time or full-time? So this obviously won't work for everyone if you need certain equipment in your office in order to do your job, but it is becoming much more commonplace. I am a remote employee, so I can say that although my employer wasn't totally prepared for me to go remote, it's worked out fine because there are a lot of ways that this can be accommodated. So since it is becoming more common, you can check to see if this is in your employee handbook, and if not, it could be a policy that could be created. Among other things, this can eliminate a draining commute and reserve your energy in order to finish your work. If your job includes allocated break times, is it possible for you to take more frequent or additional breaks? Let's say your schedule entitles you to 2 breaks and a 45-minute lunch, but what you really need is 4 breaks throughout the day. You could either maybe make your lunch shorter and add an extra break, or just request an additional break. Maybe it's about getting access to special equipment. So recently we held a job search intensive in New York City, and one of the participants mentioned that for her, the glare and text on her screens was really challenging. And so she requested a large screen and text magnification, as well as the special modification of making sure that she wasn't near any lights or windows that would exacerbate the glare. Another possibility would be having certain tasks or projects moved from your job. A couple years ago, we met a school teacher who was suffering from fatigue, but obviously they couldn't telecommute because he needed to be in the classroom teaching his required subjects for a specific number of hours each day. But part of his job was lunch and recess duty, and so the school worked out a plan and an accommodation for him to have a coworker take over lunch and recess so that he was able to rest during these periods and do some classroom preparation. Again, these are just examples to help you start thinking about accommodations and to remove some of the myths around the concept, such as accommodations are expensive or unlikely to be approved. Because the fact is that according to the Job Accommodation Network, most accommodations cost an employer $500 or less, and many of them cost nothing, such as moving offices. So be resourceful and really think about your environment and what might be causing the specific challenges that you're experiencing at work. And also keeping in mind that it's all fluid, so what would make work easier today might be different tomorrow, and there isn't only one opportunity to request them. And just so you know, you can request as many as you feel are necessary for you to do your job. So returning to work can present challenges, whether you've been away for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or more. There are pros and cons to returning to a former job. Probably the biggest pro is that you know the culture and the quirks, you know your colleagues, and you know the responsibilities that are associated with your particular role. So this means you don't have to spend time assessing and acclimating to a new work environment, which can be highly stressful. Of course, there are also cons as well. There's the very sneaky and sometimes insidious before picture, which I think many of us in various areas of our lives experience, particularly as we get older. So it's wise to remind yourself that it's okay, and in fact, it's a good idea to ease back into the routine. And remind is the operative word, as this is often easier said than done, but it's helpful to have this planted in the back of your mind as you're returning. So I hear very frequently from patients with a real fear that they're going to be branded as the cancer person forever. We've heard various stories about colleagues making cancer-related comments to patients who are returning to work. And typically, like I said, they are well-intended, but they can feel really off-putting. So these kinds of comments can be addressed using a verbal technique that we've come up with called the swivel. So it's like the professional no. It's a verbal formula or pattern, but this is used in response to cancer-related comments that might be made by one of those well-intended colleagues we've been talking about. It involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an "and" right in the middle, and swiveling the conversation back around to a topic that's more work-oriented. So for example, someone comes up to you, you've been back for maybe a week, and says, "My uncle had cancer." "I'm sorry to hear that. It must have been very hard. And what did you think about the meeting we had yesterday?" I think that this swivel technique can work in any scenario in life. I think Thanksgiving dinners, it would be really great. But ultimately, you're acknowledging the question, and you are putting an "and" right in the middle so that you're changing it back to a topic that's work appropriate. You know, even if you do work in a small environment that feels like a small family, right? You're still at work. You know, you still should be talking about work-related things. So if there's something that you don't want to talk about that's personal, you are totally entitled to let them know that that's how you feel. So being able to shift the conversation back to where you feel comfortable can feel really empowering. And it indicates to your colleagues that you're still that whole, vibrant person with a lot of professional contributions to make. Of course, there's a whole spectrum of comments that you may encounter in the workplace, and on one end of the spectrum are the well-intended people. But there are a lot who end up making comments that don't ultimately land the way that they think they're going to. So for example, your boss may say to you, "You've been looking so exhausted recently. I just didn't want to overwhelm you by adding more to your plate." For some people, this kind of comment might not be an issue. Maybe they are, in fact, exhausted, and they have a close enough relationship with their manager or their boss that commenting on how they look is an okay thing to say. But another person might feel very differently and be really bothered by that comment. And for that person, this is another area where the swivel can be really useful. So I appreciate your concern, but work is a key part of my overall well-being. And in fact, last night I had some ideas that I'd love to share with you. Again, you're swiveling the conversation back to an area that you want to talk about, which is your work and your contributions at work. Then there are those who make the comments that are just outright insensitive, which I hope you guys haven't experienced, but it's very likely that you have. So this is an example on this slide that you can read. You can also see here an example of how someone might respond to such a comment, which is rather long. So if you want to just take a minute to read it. So what really drives this idea home is that the idea can be useful to sit down and think about how you personally might respond to someone if they were to make a comment to you, so that this sounds like language that's more like you. You might even want to write it down and practice saying it out loud so the words feel comfortable coming out of your mouth. It can feel a little bit stressful to have to kind of shut these kind of conversations down, but it is really important, and practicing it with social workers can be really helpful as well. Now we're going to spend some time talking about the job search. And again, we have some data here from our 2017 survey that we did to help us set us up for that conversation. Here we're looking at responses from patients and survivors who were looking for work. So if we look at the first set of bullets, these are reasonable concerns given the two stats listed below. Sharing this information with you is not meant to scare you or to paint a negative picture, but rather to have this information in the back of your mind so you are the savviest candidate as you go for that job search. We're also going to spend some time talking more about disclosure during this job search in a little bit, so hopefully when you walk out of this room you feel more empowered around that piece of the puzzle. So it's no secret that there are many challenges and unknowns when looking for a new job, whether or not you have cancer. So it's important to try to feel in control of the process. So to start, remember that it's a fluid process, a word that you've heard me say many times today. It can take time, and you should think about what you want and not just what you need. It might help you to talk to a social worker about how you'll manage some of the disappointments and setbacks, of which there are inevitably some during the job search process. And also, make sure to see yourself as on an equal playing field as your healthy peers. Job searching is like dating or building any relationship. It's all about for the timing. So in both cases, there's various steps involved. The process builds upon itself. And it can be heavily focused on a good first impression. So in terms of dating, for example, the first phone conversation with a date is going to feel very different than a marriage proposal later on. So if someone shows up on a first date and is like an open book, sharing all of their idiosyncrasies and quirks, all the reasons why their last relationship didn't work out, that's going to read much differently than hearing that same information in 6 weeks or 6 months. So in the same way, you're not going to go on a job interview and tell them that you chew your gum really loudly or that you always leave your stuff in the conference room. The sense that we've gotten from cancer survivors is that they tend to hold themselves to a much higher standard in terms of how much they feel they need to share right out of the gate. And I just want to make sure that you all know that that's simply not necessary. You don't owe a prospective employer any more than any other job applicants do. So I just encourage you to keep this in mind, that it's important to behave appropriately in the context of where you're at in the job search process, and projecting appropriate confidence and having control is a great way to do so. So according to one of our professional career coaches, these days more than 85% of jobs are found through other people versus through job boards, headhunters, or online ads. So that's a really significant number. And so it goes without saying that networking is a necessary part of the job search process, and you have to be willing to do it. So a lot of people struggle with the idea of networking because it feels like you're asking for a favor. And that can be especially challenging if perhaps you've been out of the game for a little while and because of treatment and recovery. But the fact is that basically anyone you know can be a source for networking. It's important not to think too narrowly, such as just within your own industry or people that you've worked with before, because friends, neighbors, community members, even people sitting next to you right now can be great resources for networking, and you never know who knows who or what they've heard on the street in terms of what jobs are available. There are also online resources for doing this, like LinkedIn. This was made just for networking. It's a great way to dip your toe into networking once you start feeling like it might be time to start. It's become the go-to source for employers who are looking to hire. According to a recent study, 87% of recruiters surveyed report that LinkedIn is the most effective tool for vetting during a job search. So given that this is being used so much, you want to make sure you're utilizing it to its fullest extent. And you can do this by writing a compelling profile, asking for substantive recommendations, and posting professional updates and joining relevant groups on the site. The software will guide you on how to do this, and it's actually quite simple. And as important as LinkedIn and your overall online presence are for job searching, they do not replace the time-tested tools of job hunting, which are the resume and cover letter. I'm likely not telling you something you don't already know, but let's review some tips on just how to write one, and you can find a lot of more information in your packets that I provided. So an effective resume is one that's written with a particular audience in mind. It's professional, easy to read, and has impact. It summarizes your accomplishments succinctly rather than being an exhaustive list of everything you've ever done work-wise. The rule of thumb is 1 page for early career, 2 pages for someone more seasoned. And lastly, a compelling resume must be future-focused and targeted towards your career goals. So it's also helpful to know in this case that there's more than one type of resume. The most common is the chronological resume, and this takes readers through a candidate's work experience, job by job, beginning with the most recent. But there's also the chronological functional resume. This is more of a hybrid and could be preferable for someone with several gaps in their work history, perhaps due to cancer treatment. This isn't as common, but it can be an option if you think that a job gap is holding you back. So it might be worth experimenting with. This version highlights skills and accomplishments up at the top and lists specific job experience lower down. Cancer and Careers also offers a free resume review service by one of our career coaches. So if you submit your resume online, if you're looking for a new job or if you're looking to career change, they can help you reformat it in a way that highlights the most important skills. And also vitally important is the cover letter. So along with your resume, this is what helps get you in the door. And what's key to know about a cover letter is that it should be tailored to the specific job that you're applying for. It's also important to make sure that it isn't simply a regurgitation of your resume, but rather an opportunity to draw parallels and highlight experience that makes you suited to the role. So you also want to make connections between your specific skill set and experiences to the job and company that you're going after. So we have a job search toolkit that's in that packet that has a lot of information on that as well. So going back to disclosure, a lot of people ask us if they should include their cancer experience in their resume or their cover letter, either as a positive or as an explanation of some sort. My first response is always do whatever you're comfortable with, but think about it this way. The goal of a cover letter and resume is to get you an interview based on your skills and your potential. So in that sense, your diagnosis and treatment aren't really part of that conversation. Another thing to consider is the fact that if you disclose a diagnosis in a letter, it won't be a dynamic exchange. And by that, I mean you won't be there physically to answer any questions that they have or to clear up any confusion that they might have. So the bottom line is no one tells everything about everything during a job interview or even once they're hired. Communicate appropriately for where you are during the process. And you should do whatever feels right for you. So even if you're 100% sure that you want to disclose during the hiring process, the cover letter and resume really aren't the best way to do that. If you do feel that it's important for you to let your employer know before you've accepted a job, and for many people it has been very important for them, we typically recommend that you wait until later in the hiring process so everybody's gotten a chance to get to know what you can offer and what your skill set is, instead of just reading this information and putting you immediately into a no pile. So if you think back to the idea that job searching is like dating, it's about sharing information based on where you are in the process. And of course, always remembering that wherever you are, you're never required to share that information. So we also hear a lot from patients who are concerned about a gap on their resume being brought up during an interview and how that might affect their job prospects. So CareerBuilder came out with a study in 2012 that found that since the economic downturn in 2008, hiring managers have become more and more used to seeing gaps on people's resumes for all kinds of reasons, and a lot of the time they don't even bring it up during the interview. But it is totally reasonable that you will be asked about this, so it's a good idea to be prepared with some answers. Again, if it comes up, be future-focused, non-specific, and brief. This is another situation where the verbal technique, the swivel, can be useful. So spend some time figuring out the language that feels natural and comfortable for you to say. If someone says to you, I see you have a gap on your history, can you tell me about that? And of course, we want that answer to acknowledge the question, and then swivel the interviewer's attention back to the job at hand and the desire to get hired, and most importantly, the skill set that's on the table for you. So a lot of the times when people have asked me what they should say, again, being non-specific is a really good idea because, as I mentioned earlier, they cannot ask you specific questions. So if you don't want to disclose anything about your situation, you can say, I was dealing with a family matter that's been resolved, and I'm ready to take on X, Y, and Z, or I'm excited to get started on this new career, something along those lines, so that you're kind of shutting the conversation down. You're giving them an answer. It's vague enough so that you've provided them with an answer and you don't have to go any further. So as I mentioned when discussing sharing a diagnosis at work, it's a completely personal decision, and however you feel in regards to it is completely valid. So it's helpful to picture this on a spectrum. So it's not necessarily a black and white decision. There can be situations where you might want to share information, or you might have to share information in order to access your rights under the law. So this doesn't mean sharing every last detail of your diagnosis or your prognosis, but it just means you have to be able to provide some support for why you're eligible to be asking for what you're asking for. So for example, it would be extremely difficult to credibly file a complaint against your employer for discrimination under the ADA if they had no idea that you had a condition to discriminate against. So when I get questions regarding whether or not to disclose, I like to say you can always say more later, but you can never say less. So if there is a need for you to divulge more information down the road, you can be prepared to do so, but you don't have to offer it right away. Also, we've been discussing the context that you share the information in is important as well, so considering the timing and the circumstance of your current situation can be integral to making the best decision for you. So, as we talked about the dangers of Google and job searching, there is an upside in that you can use it to research your prospective employer, and I definitely encourage you to do so. You want to find out as much about them as you can before you meet with them. Obviously, knowing about a company before you go in for an interview is a standard practice, but it's also good to spend some time thinking about whether the company is going to be good for you and your needs specifically. So if your interview is a result of having networked with someone on staff there, then you probably already have a sense of what it would be like to work there. Still, you want to search for additional information such as, is the company well regarded? Are people tweeting how miserable they are working there? Have there been discrimination lawsuits? And if you think you might need to use reasonable accommodations, looking to see how many people there are on staff. So in other words, you just want to do some fact-finding beyond the conversations that happen as part of the interview process. If you're thinking about making a career change, there's also an information gathering process that can help you set you up for success. But you can't go to Google for this one. Instead, it's really about taking the time to think about things that most of us don't stop and evaluate regularly. So rather than just taking a leap of faith that there's some groundwork in place, you might start by asking, how do you personally define meaningful in terms of work? We often think that means jumping to a job with a charity, but meaning comes in many forms for many people and include things like what gives you satisfaction at work. Maybe for you, it comes from working with your hands or hitting specific sales goals. Only you know what meaning and satisfaction will mean to you, so take an inventory of all your skills, both the hard ones like making furniture or using a particular type of software, or the soft skills like time management or being a people person. Make the list as long as necessary in order to cover them, and maybe run it past loved ones or former colleagues to see if they have anything to add, and tell them to be nice when they do that. Then think about which of them you actually want to be using day to day at work. And from there, then think about jobs that might be relevant. Talk to people, have informational meetings. LinkedIn is a really great way to connect with people to have those informational meetings. And also take some time to think about whether it is the job that matters to you or the company that you'll work for. So for some people, it's going to be all about the specific work they're focusing their energy into doing day to day. And for others, it's going to be about being part of a larger organization or community. One is not necessarily better than the other. It's really just about figuring out what's going to work best for you. So clearly the ultimate goal of the job search is to get a job with a new employer. And certainly starting with a new employer has also pros and cons to it. One very big pro about going to a new employer versus returning to the old one is that you get a fresh start. And that's because there's no pre-existing cancer identity to speak of. So you get to choose if you want to share that information or not, and so that means there's no before picture that you're in competition with. On the flip side, one of the cons of starting over is that you don't know any of the basics about the place, so you're going to have to utilize some energy and emotional focus to figure out the ins and outs. Research shows that your first 90 days in a new job are crucial in terms of setting yourself up to succeed. So it's wise to spend some time and some of your energy figuring out the landscape of the new place that you've landed in, including what the quirks and dysfunctions are, because every company is dysfunctional in some way. And also figuring out how to best manage your energy. What's important to remember is that in order to do well, it's not mandatory that you work a ton of hours. Instead, focus on creating a simple plan on how you're going to learn the ins and outs of your new job and the culture. And if it starts to feel overwhelming, then break it down into smaller pieces. And perhaps most importantly to remember, no one hires a new employee hoping that they're going to fail. They want you to succeed so that you're a good asset for that company. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to find out what it means to be successful in your new job. And I always encourage people to ask that in the actual interview. What does a success in this job look like? But keep in mind that hiring a particular person is a conscious choice that an employer makes. And so you're at that job for a reason, and that reason has to do with who you are and your past accomplishments. So it's important to remember that. And above all, take care of yourself physically and mentally, because that's really the best foundation for success as you're going through your personal and your work life. So that's it for me in terms of content today. These are just some offerings that we have. We have a webinar series, as I mentioned. We have one final one for this year. It's called Body Confidence and Self-Confidence in the Workplace. If you're unable to attend the live session, we do archive them on our website. That link right there. And we also offer the free publications that are available in your packets, as well as additional ones online. And we have two dates for our conferences at this point. We have our Midwest Conference in Chicago in March and our National Conference in June in New York. We have travel scholarships for both, so if you're interested in attending, I definitely encourage you to do so. It's been a really great experience for those who have been able to travel there. These are a couple of resources. I mentioned some legal resources, and here is my contact information if any of you are interested in following up with me after today, or if anything comes up as you're looking for work or at your job or anything like that.